Chapter 1. The Anonymous Hand. There is a single stone in the nave of Beverley Minster in East Yorkshire that has been noticed by careful visitors for about 200 years. It sits in the wall at roughly chest height in the north nave aisle. It is a perfectly ordinary piece of magnesian limestone, dressed smooth and set into the mortar, like every other stone in the wall. And carved into its face, in the brief window of time between when the stonemason finished dressing it and when the mortar went on and the stone was set permanently in place, is a small picture. A man, roughly drawn but unmistakable. He is sitting, his legs are crossed, his hands are at his sides. He appears to be resting, that is all. No name, no date, no context. Just a small drawing made by a medieval stonemason who paused in his working day at some point in the early 14th century and scratched his own image into the stone he was about to hide forever inside a wall. He could not have known you would find it. He could not have known that his building would survive another 700 years, that the stone he was about to set would outlast his children and his children's children by so many generations that the number becomes meaningless, that visitors from the future would stand in his building and try to imagine who he was. He left no name. He left a picture. That picture is, in its small way, the truest monument to the builders of the great cathedrals and minster churches of Britain. Not the guidebook history, not the names of the bishops and kings who commissioned the buildings, but this, a man at rest inside the wall he was raising, marking himself, saying, quietly, I was here. I did this. Remember me. Nobody remembers him. We do not know his name. We do not know where he came from or where he went when the Beverley contract ended. We do not know if he had a family or what became of them. We don't know what he believed or how he understood the work he was doing or whether he thought the building he was raising was beautiful. We have his picture in a wall, and the building he raised is still standing. Tonight we are going to try to find the people inside the walls. Not the people the history books remember. The ones who have been forgotten. The ones who knew things that were never written down. Who built things that should not have been possible with the understanding that modern scholarship can recover. Who worked in a tradition whose origins reach back into a past that is, in some important respects, still dark. We are going to go slowly. The way you go when you are walking through a very old building and you want to feel, not just see, where you are. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you like. Let us find the people in the walls. Chapter 2. The problem with the official story. The official history of how the great medieval cathedrals of Britain were built goes something like this. A bishop or an abbot decides to build. He raises funds through donations from the faithful, from wealthy patrons, from the revenues of his see. He appoints a master of the works, sometimes a clergyman, who administers the project financially and coordinates logistics, and a master builder who carries the actual design and construction responsibility. The master builder designs the building using the geometric methods of the Gothic tradition. He recruits a workforce of specialist craftsmen and general labourers. The building proceeds in campaigns, pausing when money runs out and resuming when more is raised. Over decades, sometimes over a century or two, the building takes its final form. This is not wrong. As a general outline of the process, it describes something real, but it omits so much that what it leaves out is actually more interesting than what it includes. It omits the question of who the master builder was, where he came from, who trained him, and what tradition of knowledge he carried. For most medieval English cathedrals, the master builder's name is unknown, or known only in the most fragmentary way. For the ones we can identify, the story of their training and their knowledge is often surprising. It omits the question of what was on the site before the cathedral was built, and who decided that this specific piece of ground should be considered sacred, and how long it had been considered sacred before any bishop arrived with building plans. It emits the rich and complex social world of the workers themselves, the masons and carpenters and glaziers and plumbers and smiths who spent their working lives on these buildings, the women who carried materials and burned lime and whose names appear nowhere in the architectural record, the migrant workers who travelled hundreds of miles from site to site, carrying technical knowledge with them in a way that was, in the pre-printing era, the primary mechanism for disseminating design innovation. It omits the oral traditions, the lodge customs, the fraternal practices, the oath-bound brotherhoods that controlled the transmission of the craft's knowledge and that were, deliberately and systematically, secretive. And it omits the question of what came before, not just what was on the specific site before the cathedral, though that is important. What came before the entire Christian tradition of sacred building in Britain. What the people who lived here before Augustine's missionaries arrived in 597 CE understood about sacred space, about the relationship between certain locations and a sense of the divine, about the geometry of the landscape and the movements of the heavens. All of these omissions matter, and all of them, when you start filling them in, change the story. Not into something mystical or conspiratorial, into something more interesting than either of those things, into a human story, a story of knowledge and skill and secrecy and tradition and the slow accumulation of understanding across more generations than we can easily imagine. Let us begin filling them in, one stone at a time. Chapter 3. What Augustine found when Augustine landed in Kent in 597 CE, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to begin the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, he found a landscape that was already full of sacred places, not empty hilltops, not virgin wilderness, waiting for the civilizing touch of Christianity, a landscape with its own religious geography, its own hierarchy of significant sites, its own traditions of communal worship and individual spiritual practice, built up over thousands of years of continuous human occupation. The Saxons, who now ruled most of England, south of the Humber, had their own gods. Woden, Thunor, Tiu, Freya, the Germanic deities whose names survive in our days of the week. Wednesday is Woden's day, Thursday is Thunor's day, Friday is Freya's day. The days of the week carry the old gods around with them, invisible and unrecognized in every office calendar and digital diary in the country. The Saxons built temples to these gods, usually described in Latin sources as Fana or Delubra, and they gathered at sacred trees and sacred springs and on hilltops that had been considered sacred since before the Saxons arrived in Britain. But underneath the Saxon religious layer, there was the Romano-British layer, the Christian communities that had existed in Roman Britain, which had produced martyrs like Alban of Verulamium, and had apparently maintained some kind of continuity in the western and northern parts of the island through the period of Saxon invasion and settlement. Roman temples, some of which had been built on even older sacred sites, still standing in various states of preservation. And underneath the Romano-British layer, there was the Iron Age layer, Celtic religion in its British form, centered on sacred groves called Nemeton, on rivers and springs and lakes, on the specialized knowledge of the Druids who served as priests and scholars and judges and historians in Celtic society. The Druids were systematically suppressed by the Roman administration in Britain, beginning in the 1st century CE. But the sacred geography they had maintained, the specific places that had been considered holy for generations, that did not disappear with the Druids. And underneath the Iron Age layer, there was the Bronze Age. And underneath the Bronze Age, the Neolithic. 2,000 years of sacred building in Britain before the Celtic period, leaving the long barrows and the stone circles and the earthwork henges and the alignments and the ceremonial landscapes that are still, 3 and 4 and 5,000 years later, among the most extraordinary human constructions in the world. Augustine was standing at the end of a very long tradition. Gregory's instruction to incorporate existing sacred sites was not naive. Gregory understood, as a careful and experienced churchman, that you do not fight the sense of sacredness that communities feel about specific places. You work with it, you redirect it, you give it a new name and a new theology while leaving the fundamental human experience of those places unchanged. This was brilliant pastoral strategy. It was also, in the long run, a decision that meant the sacred geography of pre-Christian Britain was preserved within the sacred geography of Christian Britain. The springs became holy wells. The sacred groves became churchyards with their distinctive ancient trees. The hilltops became the sites of churches dedicated to the Archangel Michael, the warrior of heaven who fights the dragon, a figure that resonates with very old traditions of the sacred significance of hilltops as places where heaven and earth are close. When the Norman bishops began their great cathedral building campaign after 1066, they were building on Saxon churches that had been built on Romano-British sacred sites, that had been built on Iron Age holy places, that had been built on Bronze Age ceremonial landscapes. They were, in a very literal archaeological sense, building on the past. The foundations of British Christianity are not 2,000 years old. They are 5,000 years old at minimum, and the cathedrals that sit on those foundations carry that depth within them, whether or not anyone who visits them knows it. Chapter 4. Peterborough and the Preserved Face. Most English cathedrals have been transformed so many times, rebuilt and extended and restored and altered, that the building you see bears only a partial resemblance to what was there originally. Peterborough Cathedral is different. The west front of Peterborough Cathedral, built in the first quarter of the 13th century, is one of the most extraordinary facades in English architecture. It consists of 3 enormous arched porches, each one rising to a pointed gable, the central one slightly higher than the 2 flanking ones, creating a composition of almost theatrical drama that dominates the market square of the small Cambridgeshire city in front of it. It is, for various reasons of architectural development within the cathedral, quite unlike any other west front in England. The arches are so large, and the spaces between the main elements of the facade are so open that the composition seems to contradict itself, to be all entrance and no wall. Architectural historians have puzzled over it for generations. Some have suggested that the original design was never completed. Some have proposed that the existing facade represents a design that was modified during construction in ways that produced the unusual result. But what is perhaps most significant about Peterborough is what is inside. The nave of Peterborough Cathedral, built in the late 12th century and surviving more or less intact beneath its later painted ceiling, is one of the most complete Norman Romanesque interiors in England. The painted nave ceiling, dating from around 1220, is the largest surviving Romanesque painted ceiling in Britain, an extraordinary survival that gives a vivid picture of what a medieval cathedral interior looked like before the reformers of the 16th century whitewashed the walls and cleared the altars. And in the apse at the east end of the north choir aisle, there is a small painted panel, probably dating to the mid-12th century, that shows 3 figures. 2 of them are identifiable as saints. The third is more ambiguous. He stands to one side, slightly separated from the holy figures, and he holds what appears to be a measuring instrument, a set square, or possibly a compass. The figure has been interpreted as a donor, a patron who paid for the painting and requested his own inclusion in it. But the measuring instrument is unusual for a donor portrait. Donors are typically shown in prayer, hands pressed together, looking toward the holy figures. This man is holding a tool, a craftsman's tool. He may be the master builder. If he is one of the very few images of a medieval English master builder that exists. He has no name on the painting. He has no inscription. But he is there, standing at the edge of the holy scene, holding the instrument of his trade, apparently claiming a place in the sacred space that his building was designed to create. This is a remarkable act of self-assertion for a period when the conventional understanding was that the building belonged to God and the glory of it should not be claimed by any human being. Whoever he was, he wanted to be remembered. He could not write his name on the building. He found another way. The measuring instrument is still there. The man who held it is not. Chapter 5. The Exeter Mystery. Exeter Cathedral in Devon is, among English cathedrals, a special case. Not because it is the grandest, though it is very beautiful. Not because it has the most extraordinary history, though its history is rich. But because its building accounts survive in remarkable completeness for a period stretching from the 1270s to the mid-14th century, giving us a window into the actual process of medieval cathedral construction that exists nowhere else in England with comparable clarity. The accounts are in Latin, written on rolls of parchment that have been preserved in the cathedral archive. They record, week by week and sometimes day by day, the wages paid to named workers, the materials purchased, the prices paid for stone and timber, and lead and sand and lime, the costs of transporting materials from quarry to building site, the fees paid to specialist craftsmen brought in for specific phases of work. They are not complete. There are gaps. Some rolls are damaged, some periods are poorly documented. But what survives is enough to reconstruct, in considerable detail, the economic and organizational reality of a major medieval building project. What the accounts show, first and most immediately, is the scale of the enterprise. In the most active periods of construction, the payroll at Exeter ran to more than 100 workers in a single week. Masons and carpenters and plumbers and glaciers and smiths and sawyers and quarrymen and carters and labourers, all receiving weekly wages that varied with their skill and their place in the hierarchy of the craft. The master mason receives more than anyone else. The journeyman masons receive less. The labourers, the unskilled workers who carry stone and mix mortar, receive the least. The accounts also show something that challenges the romantic picture of cathedral builders as devout artisans working for the glory of God. They struck. In 1342, a group of masons working at Exeter refused to continue working at the wages they were being paid. They demanded more. The chapter, which is the governing body of the cathedral, recorded the dispute in the accounts with evident irritation and eventually settled it by paying the masons what they asked. Medieval cathedral builders went on strike. They were workers. They had labour interests. They understood the leverage that came from possessing skills that the cathedral chapter needed and could not easily replace. And they used that leverage exactly as workers have used leverage in labour disputes before and since. This is not the story that is usually told about these buildings, and the accounts tell other stories too. The account of a carpenter who was injured falling from scaffolding and whose medical expenses were paid by the chapter. The account of a glazier whose name appears briefly and then disappears. Presumably, he moved on to another commission or died. The account of a delivery of stone that arrived damaged and had to be returned. The account of a payment to a woman for carrying sand. All of these small human details, preserved in Latin on aging parchment in a cathedral archive, are the real history of how Exeter Cathedral was built. Not the names of the bishops, not the aesthetic judgments of later architectural historians, the weekly wages and the labour disputes and the accidents and the deliveries. The building was built by people doing a job they may have taken pride in, for which there is also some evidence in the accounts, a job that required extraordinary skill and knowledge, a job that was, at its best moments, probably deeply satisfying in the way that any physical craft done well is satisfying, but a job done by workers who had names and disputes and accidents, and, sometimes, the desire to draw a small picture of themselves in the wall before the mortar went on. Chapter 6. The great west fronts stand back from Wells Cathedral's west front. Stand far enough back that you can see the whole thing, from the towers at the top to the level of the street at the bottom. What you are looking at is the largest and most complete surviving medieval sculptural program in Britain. The west front of Wells, built between approximately 1230 and 1260, contains in its carved niches the figures of roughly 300 saints, bishops, angels, apostles, kings, and prophets. Some of the niches are now empty, their figures lost to Reformation iconoclasm or to weather. But a substantial majority of the figures survive, and they survive with traces, in some cases, of their original paint, because the figures were painted, every single one of them. The west front of Wells was not the pale grey limestone that you see today. It was a polychrome extravaganza, the figures painted in vivid colours, the architectural details picked out in red and blue and gold. It would have been, to a medieval visitor approaching the cathedral across the open ground in front of it, something closer to a theatrical spectacle than to the refined archaeological object we tend to see today. The carving of these 300 figures was the work of a specialised workshop, probably established specifically for this project, and drawing craftsmen from across the southwest of England and possibly from the continent. The figures are not all of equal quality. Some are extraordinary, among the finest examples of early English sculptural art that survive. Some are workmanlike. The quality varies in ways that suggest multiple hands working at different skill levels under the direction of a leading sculptor whose own work stands out by its refinement. We do not know his name. We know he existed because the stylistic analysis of the Wells figures, carried out by the art historian and medievalist Neil Stratford in the late 20th century, identifies a distinct hand within the overall program. A master carver whose work on specific figures is recognizably different in quality and in the handling of drapery and expression from the work of his subordinates. He is there in the stone. He is not in the documents. Lincoln Cathedral's west front is a different kind of achievement. The Norman facade, which survives as the core of the existing front, is framed by the two towers that were added in subsequent centuries, and the whole composition, seen from the long straight road that approaches the cathedral from the south, is almost impossibly dramatic. The cathedral sits on its limestone ridge like a crown. Exeter's west front, damaged and restored and somewhat confused in its current state by Victorian interventions, preserves in its lower zones some of the most interesting figurative carving in Devon. A frieze of secular figures, mounted knights and musicians and fighting men, running across the facade at eye level, is a reminder that the visual programs of medieval cathedrals were not exclusively theological. They contained representations of the secular world, of the society that worshipped within, of the culture that the building was built to express and to serve. And the west front of Salisbury, the broadest and flattest of the great English cathedral facades, is interesting precisely for its restraint. Unlike Wells, with its 300 carved figures, unlike Lincoln, with its dramatic topographic setting, Salisbury's west front is almost abstract, a screen of blind arcading and niches that hints at the ordered interior geometry of the building behind it, without quite resolving into a narrative. Each of these fronts was the work of a specific workshop, a specific moment in the development of the Gothic tradition in England, a specific set of choices made by people whose names we usually do not know about how a building should present itself to the world. The fronts are the public faces of the buildings. They were designed to be seen, to be impressive, to communicate the ambition and the devotion of the community that raised them. The people who designed them are the buildings themselves. That is the only legacy they left. Chapter 7. The Glassmakers. The windows of a Gothic cathedral are not simply windows. They are walls made of light. The structural revolution of the Gothic style, the flying buttress and the ribbed vault and the pointed arch working together, allowed the medieval builders to reduce the amount of solid wall in a building to the minimum required for structural stability and to fill the rest of the wall plane with glass. The result, in a fully developed Gothic cathedral like Chartres or York or Canterbury, is an interior in which the boundary between inside and outside is dissolved. The walls are not walls, they are filters. The world outside the building, the sky and the light, is present inside the building, transformed by the coloured glass into something that is neither fully outside nor fully inside. The theological reading of this effect was explicit in the medieval period. Light was understood as a divine attribute. God was light in the Gospel of John. The flooding of the cathedral interior with transformed light was an experience of the divine, not merely a metaphor for it. The production of the glass that made this possible was a separate craft tradition from the masonry that produced the structural framework. Glassmaking and glass painting were specialist skills that existed in a parallel world to the world of the masons. With their own training systems, their own workshops, their own regional traditions, and their own secrets. Medieval stained glass production involved two distinct operations. The first was the making of the glass itself, in which sand and wood ash and metal oxides were melted together in furnaces to produce glass of specific colours. The colours came from specific metallic compounds. Cobalt produced blue. Copper produced green or red, depending on the oxidizing conditions of the furnace. Manganese produced purple. Iron produced green or yellow. The precise recipes for specific colours were closely held in trade secrets, and the quality and consistency of colour varied enormously between different workshops. The second operation was the painting and leading, in which pieces of coloured glass were cut to shape, painted with iron oxide pigments in vitreous enamel for details like faces and drapery folds, fired in a kiln to fix the paint, and then assembled into panels using strips of lead, called cames. The assembled panels were set into stone tracery frames within the window opening. The skills required for both operations, and especially for the design and execution of a complex figurative window, were substantial. The leading artist who designed a great program of stained glass, like the Tree of Jesse window at Canterbury or the Great East window at York, was an artist of real sophistication, capable of designing complex figural compositions, managing the technical constraints of the medium, coordinating a workshop of assistants, and producing work that would survive the centuries. At Canterbury, the glass in the Trinity Chapel, installed in the years around 1200 to 1220, is among the finest medieval glass in the world. It depicts the life and miracles of Thomas Becket in a series of medallion windows of extraordinary clarity and narrative power. The figures are small in scale, but precise in detail. The colours are intense and harmonious. The compositions are varied and inventive. Who designed them? We do not know. A workshop is implied by the consistency of style and the scale of the commission. A leading master is implied by the quality of the best figures, but no name is attached. No document identifies the glass painter or painters who worked on the Trinity Chapel windows. The glass has been there for 800 years. The person who designed it has been unknown for almost as long. There is one partial exception to the general anonymity of medieval English glass painters. In the north choir aisle of York Minster, there is a window dating to around 1170 that carries, in a small inscription at the bottom, a name. It reads, in Latin, Master Robert of Keene made this window. That is almost all. Master Robert, his workshop. Keene, which may be a place name or a family name, is not clearly identified, but he wanted to be known. He put his name on his work. Master Robert of Keene is one of perhaps a handful of medieval English glass painters or craftsmen who attach their names to specific surviving works. He stands out from the silence by virtue of this single act of self-identification. He is there. He has a name. The thousands of others do not. Chapter 8. The Carpenters and the Timber Tradition. Stone gets the attention. When people think about medieval cathedral construction, they think about masonry, the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults, the flying buttresses, the carved capitals. They think about stone, but the cathedrals are also substantially timber buildings, and the tradition of carpentry that produced the great timber roofs and timber ceilings of English medieval churches is a tradition as sophisticated, as technically demanding, and as poorly documented as the masonry tradition. The timber roofs of English cathedrals come in two broad categories. There are the structural roofs that sit above stone vaults, invisible to the visitor inside but essential for protecting the vault from weather. And there are the open timber roofs that are themselves the ceiling of the building, visible from below, often of extraordinary beauty. The hammer beam roof, which is a specifically English structural type, takes its name from the horizontal beam, the hammer beam, that projects from the wall at the foot of each rafter like a supported lever. The hammer beam allows the carpenter to span a much wider space than would be possible with a simple tie-beam roof, because the geometry of the structure distributes the forces through the hammer posts and the arch bracing rather than through a single tension member across the full width of the span. The most spectacular surviving hammer beam roofs are not in cathedrals, but in secular buildings. Westminster Hall's hammer beam roof, built by Hugh Herland in the 1390s and spanning 20 metres with no intermediate supports, is probably the greatest timber structure of the medieval period anywhere in Europe. But the tradition that produced Westminster Hall was the same tradition that produced the timber roofs of the great medieval churches. Hugh Herland was a rare example of a medieval carpenter whose career is relatively well documented. He appears in the royal building accounts from the 1360s onward, working on a series of major royal commissions, and he is identified as the king's chief carpenter in several documents. His work at Westminster Hall is confirmed by the survival of his design drawings, or at least drawings contemporary with the construction, in a collection of architectural drawings that are among the oldest surviving works of English architectural design. The drawings show the geometry of the roof, the angles, the proportions, the way the structure was designed to distribute its loads. They show a man who thought geometrically, who designed in the same language of compass and straightedge that the masonry tradition used, who understood structure through a combination of geometric construction and empirical knowledge. That was, in its practical effectiveness, equivalent to formal structural mechanics. Herland's design was right. The Westminster Hall roof has been standing for over 600 years. But Herland is exceptional in being documented at all. The hundreds of other medieval carpenters who designed and built the timber roofs of English cathedrals and churches are as anonymous as the masons. They are in the wood, not in the records, and the wood, in many cases, has outlasted the records by centuries. There are oak timbers in the roofs of English medieval churches that came from trees that were standing when William the Conqueror was born. The trees are gone. The buildings they sheltered are gone in some cases. But the timber survives in roof spaces that visitors never see, carrying the weight of the roof above the vault, keeping the rain out, doing the unglamorous essential work that allows the beautiful spaces below to remain beautiful. The carpenters who shaped those timbers are 700 years gone. The work of their hands is still standing over our heads. Chapter 9. What the dissolution destroyed in 1534, Henry VIII broke with Rome. In 1536, the dissolution of the smaller monasteries began. In 1539, the larger monasteries followed. By 1540, the monastic system, that had dominated English religious life and English intellectual life for 700 years was gone. The monks were pensioned off or found other positions. The monasteries were either converted to other uses or demolished, their stone quarried for building material by the new owners of the land. The effect on the cathedral building tradition was decisive and permanent. Many English cathedrals were monastic cathedrals, governed by a chapter of monks under the authority of a prior rather than by a chapter of secular clergy. Winchester, Canterbury, Durham, Ely, Norwich, Worcester, Gloucester, Chester, Peterborough, Rochester, Carlisle. All of these were Benedictine or Augustinian cathedral priories. When the monasteries were dissolved, they were converted into secular cathedrals, their monastic chapters replaced by chapters of secular canons. The building workshops that had been maintained by the monastic establishments were closed. The masons who had worked for the cathedral priories found themselves without institutional employers. Some attached themselves to the new secular chapters. Some found work on other building projects. Some retired. But the institutional continuity of the building tradition was broken. This matters because the craft knowledge of the medieval building workshops was not primarily written knowledge. It was practical knowledge held in the hands and the minds of craftsmen, transmitted through apprenticeship and daily working practice within the workshop. When the workshops closed, the transmission mechanism for that knowledge was disrupted. In the decades after the dissolution, the quality of surviving English architectural craft begins, in the judgment of most architectural historians, to decline. Not uniformly and not immediately, but the trajectory is clear. The knowledge that had produced the great perpendicular vaults of King's College Chapel in Cambridge in the 1480s and 1490s, or the extraordinary fan vaulting of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey in the first decade of the 16th century, was not fully transmitted to the next generation. Fan vaulting, the most elaborate and technically demanding form of English Gothic vault, effectively ended with the dissolution. The knowledge required to design and build it had been held within the workshop tradition of a small number of specialist master masons, and when that tradition was disrupted, it was not recovered. The later examples of fan vaulting in English architecture, like the work of Christopher Wren's collaborators in the late 17th century and the Gothic revival fan vaults of the 19th century, are scholarly reconstructions. Impressive, but subtly different from the originals. The dissolution also destroyed archives. The monastic libraries and archives contained the accumulated documentation of centuries of building activity, account rolls, design drawings, lodge regulations, correspondence between building masters and their patrons. The records that might have told us who designed the great medieval buildings were in large part destroyed, dispersed, or simply lost in the chaos of the dissolution. What survives is fragments, partial accounts, incomplete document series, isolated drawings. The full story of who built the cathedrals is partly unrecoverable, not because it was never recorded, but because the records were destroyed. History has a way of destroying its own evidence. Chapter 10. The Lodge and its Secrets. The term lodge in the medieval building trades referred to a physical structure erected adjacent to a major building site to house the craftsman's tools, to provide a covered workspace for the detailed carving and preparation of stonework, and to serve as the social and organizational center of the working community. The lodge was also, in a more abstract sense, the organizational unit of the craft. A lodge had a master, its senior practitioner. It had fellows, the journeymen and senior apprentices, who made up the skilled workforce. It had regulations, governing behavior within the lodge and relations with other lodges. And it had, in some documented cases, ceremonies of initiation and obligation that marked the transition from one grade of the craft to another. The evidence for the ceremonial and fraternal aspects of the medieval building lodge is limited and contested. The Regius poem and the Cook manuscript, which we mentioned earlier, give us a picture of an organization with formal structures and with secrets. Later documents, from the 17th century onward, give us more detail about the lodge practices of operative masons, the men who actually worked stone for a living, as opposed to the speculative Freemasons who adopted the symbolism of the craft for philosophical and fraternal purposes. The distinction between operative and speculative masonry is important and is often confused in popular writing about Freemasonry and medieval cathedrals. Speculative Freemasonry, the form of Freemasonry that exists today as a fraternal organization with charitable and social functions, was formally organized in 1717 with the founding of the Grand Lodge of England in London. It drew on the symbolism, the terminology, and some of the organizational structures of the older operative masonry tradition, but it was not a direct continuation of it. Speculative Freemasons were typically educated gentlemen with no connection to the building trades, who used the tools and the vocabulary of masonry as metaphors for a philosophical and ethical program. The operative masons, the men who actually worked in stone and transmitted practical building knowledge through guild apprenticeship, were a separate world. Their organizations were real craft organizations, focused on controlling entry to the trade, maintaining standards of quality, and protecting the economic interests of their members. Their secrets were, at core, trade secrets, geometric design methods, structural techniques, the specific knowledge that made them valuable to cathedral builders. But the two worlds, the operative craftsman and the speculative gentleman, shared a vocabulary, a set of symbols, and a self-understanding that traced the origins of their craft to very ancient sources. And that shared self-understanding, however much it may be legend rather than history, reflects a real conviction that the knowledge of the builders was old, was transmitted through unbroken chains of initiation and apprenticeship, and was more than merely technical. The builders believed they knew something profound, something about the relationship between geometry and the structure of the universe, something about the proportions that God had used in creating the world, which the builder could replicate in creating a building that would itself become a kind of ordered cosmos in miniature. Whether that belief was mystical or practical or some inseparable combination of both, it was the framework within which the cathedral builders understood their own work, and it is still encoded in the buildings, if you know how to read it. Chapter 11. Durham's Other Secret. We have discussed Durham Cathedral in the context of its impossibly early ribbed vaults, but Durham has another architectural secret that receives less attention. The Galilee Chapel. The Galilee Chapel is a westward extension of the cathedral, added in the 1170s, and it is architecturally unlike anything else at Durham. The nave and choir of the cathedral are massive, thick-walled, heavy, quintessentially Norman Romanesque in their bulk and gravity. The Galilee Chapel is delicate, its columns are slender, its arches are pointed but also decorated with a zigzag ornament called chevron, a typically Norman motif. It has a lightness, an airiness, that feels almost Gothic despite being built in the Norman period. The Galilee Chapel was added to the west end of Durham Cathedral under the direction of Bishop Hugh de Puiset, who became Bishop of Durham in 1153. According to a chronicler of the period, de Puiset attempted to build a new chapel at the east end of the cathedral first, but the foundations kept failing. Cracks appeared. The structure was unstable. After multiple unsuccessful attempts, he gave up on the east end and built at the west instead. This story has been taken at face value by many historians. A bishop who wanted to expand his cathedral had trouble with the foundations at one end and built at the other end instead. But some architectural historians have proposed a different reading. The east end of Durham Cathedral was, and is, the site of the shrine of St. Cuthbert. Cuthbert, the 7th century bishop of Lindisfarne, whose relics had been brought to Durham in 995 CE, after a long period of wandering following the Viking raids on Lindisfarne, was the spiritual heart of the cathedral. His shrine was the most sacred location in the building, the reason for the building's existence, the destination of the pilgrims who came from across the north of England and beyond. The chronicler's story of failed foundations at the East End has been interpreted by some researchers as a polite encoding of a different kind of problem. Not structural failure, but spiritual resistance. The story encodes the tradition that St. Cuthbert, famously a misogynist in the medieval legends that surrounded him, had somehow opposed the building of a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary near his own shrine. And the failure of the foundations was understood as the saint's supernatural rejection of the project. This reading may or may not be correct. The theological politics of major medieval religious establishments were complex, and a dispute about where to build a chapel could have been conducted in architectural terms, while actually being conducted in terms of power and precedent and tradition. But what the story illustrates is the extent to which the physical decisions made in medieval cathedral buildings were not purely rational or purely practical. They were entangled with theology, with the politics of the saints, with the accumulated traditions and expectations of the religious communities that inhabited these buildings. The master builder did not simply design the best possible building in purely structural terms. He designed a building that had to satisfy multiple competing requirements: structural soundness, liturgical appropriateness, theological symbolism, political legibility, the desires of the patron, the traditions of the site, the constraints of the available materials and workforce. Every great medieval cathedral is the product of that complexity, the result of thousands of decisions, each one made within constraints that we can only partially reconstruct. And the Galilee Chapel, in its delicate pointed arches and its chevron-decorated columns, its eastern windows aligned to look out over the river Wear, is a beautiful resolution of one set of those constraints, whatever those constraints actually were. Chapter 12. The Scottish Tradition. The great medieval cathedrals of Scotland occupy a slightly different position in the architectural history of Britain from their English counterparts, and they deserve attention on their own terms. Scotland was not conquered by the Normans in 1066. The Norman influence on Scottish religious architecture arrived more slowly, through the marriage of King Malcolm III of Scotland to the Anglo-Saxon Princess Margaret in 1069, and through the deliberate policy of Malcolm's successors, particularly David I, who reigned from 1124 to 1153, of encouraging the settlement of Norman knights and Norman clergy in Scotland. David I was one of the great builders of Scottish ecclesiastical history. He founded or refounded a series of religious houses: Dunfermline, Kelso, Melrose, Jedburgh, Dryburgh, Holyrood, that became the centres of a Scottish monastic tradition, closely connected to the Anglo-Norman tradition south of the border. The abbeys he founded were built in the Romanesque style, with craftsmen and master builders, drawn in some cases directly from England and Normandy. The Scottish episcopal cathedrals that developed from the 12th century onward, at St Andrews, Glasgow, Elgin, Aberdeen, Dunblane, Dunkeld, and elsewhere, share many characteristics with their English contemporaries. The same basic structural vocabulary of pointed arches and ribbed vaults, the same proportional traditions, the same use of local stone. But there are differences. The Scottish cathedrals tend to be lower in relative height than their English counterparts, partly because the local building stones, often granites and coarser sandstones, are less predictable in behaviour than the fine limestones that were available in central and southern England. Height requires confidence in the material. The English builders had that confidence partly because the limestone belt of central England is consistent and reliable. Some Scottish builders, working with less predictable materials, were more conservative. The Scottish cathedrals also tend, in their surviving fragments, to show a slightly different decorative sensibility. a persistence of Celtic interlaced patterns in carved decoration that reflects the different cultural tradition of Scotland, a preference for certain kinds of surface pattern that appears in Scottish work across the medieval period. And the Scottish cathedrals were, in many cases, more thoroughly destroyed at the Reformation than their English equivalents. The Scottish Reformation of 1560 was more radical and more iconoclastic than the English Reformation of the 1530s. While the English dissolution of the monasteries was primarily a financial and political operation, the Scottish Reformation involved widespread popular destruction of religious images and furnishings. Many Scottish abbey and cathedral churches were stripped of their contents, had their roofs removed, and were left open to the weather. The resulting deterioration over the following centuries reduced many of them to ruins. St. Andrew's Cathedral, which was, at the time of its completion in the 13th century, the largest cathedral ever built in Scotland, with a nave of over 100 metres, now exists as a scattered collection of wall fragments and isolated towers in a field overlooking the North Sea. The great building, the seat of the most powerful bishopric in Scotland, is gone. What remains is just enough to suggest what was lost. Elgin Cathedral, called the Lantern of the North in medieval texts, was burned by the Wolf of Badenoch in 1390, partially rebuilt, and then stripped at the Reformation. Its octagonal chapter house, one of the finest examples of Scottish Gothic architecture, survives alongside substantial wall fragments that give a strong impression of the scale and quality of the original building. Melrose Abbey, though technically an abbey rather than a cathedral, is one of the best preserved examples of the Gothic style in Scotland. Its decorated stonework, particularly the flying buttresses and the carved details of the south transept, gives the best surviving picture of what the great Scottish Gothic buildings looked like before the destructions of the 16th century. The people who built these buildings, in Scotland as in England, are largely nameless. The master builders who worked in Scotland in the medieval period are even more poorly documented than their English counterparts, because the administrative infrastructure that produced the English building accounts, the cathedral chapter, records, and the royal building accounts was less well developed in Scotland, and the losses of documentation at the Reformation were proportionally greater. The buildings themselves, even in ruin, are the testimony. Chapter 13. The Plumber's Art. There is a craft that made the cathedrals weatherproof and that receives almost no attention in the conventional history of medieval architecture. Plumbing. Not plumbing in the modern sense of water pipes and drainage systems, though medieval plumbing, in that sense, also existed in some cathedral establishments. Plumbing in the medieval sense of working with lead, from the Latin plumbum, meaning lead, which is where both the word plumber and the chemical symbol Pb come from. The roofs of medieval cathedrals were covered with lead. Not all of them. Some used stone slates, and wooden shingles were used in some periods. But the great majority of the major medieval cathedrals of England had lead roofs, and the maintenance of those lead roofs was a continuous and essential element of the fabric maintenance that kept the buildings intact. Lead has specific properties that made it uniquely suitable for medieval roof covering. It is malleable enough to be worked cold or with minimal heat. It is durable, with a life expectancy on a well-laid roof that can exceed 100 years. It is self-sealing. When two pieces of lead overlap and the upper piece is dressed down, the soft metal conforms to the surface beneath and creates a weather-tight joint without any additional sealant. And it can be repaired in situ by a skilled plumber with basic tools, without dismantling the roof. The plumbers who worked on medieval cathedrals were specialist craftsmen, separate from the masons and the carpenters, organized in their own craft associations with their own training structures. They typically worked not from a single building workshop, but as traveling specialists, moving between commissions, bringing their tools and their molten lead in a portable furnace from site to site. At Exeter, the building accounts record payments to plumbers for various elements of the roof covering over several decades. At Winchester, the famous waterlogged crypt, which we discussed in the previous script, is partly a consequence of the lead roof drainage system, directing water in specific ways across the site. At York, the lead roof of the nave, replaced in the Victorian period following structural concerns, turned out, when examined, to contain in its lower layers some medieval lead that had been relayed and extended over centuries of use. The plumber's craft was invisible in the sense that a well-laid lead roof is invisible. You know it is there because nothing leaks, but you do not think about it unless something goes wrong. When something went wrong at a medieval cathedral, the documentary record typically takes notice. An entry in an account roll records payment to a plumber to repair damage caused by a storm, or to relieve a section of roof that had deteriorated, or to deal with the aftermath of a fall of masonry that damaged the covering. From these entries, you can reconstruct something of the plumber's world. They came from specific regions. They knew each other by reputation. They were called on at short notice for emergency repairs and employed for longer periods for major re-roofing operations. They trained apprentices who eventually became journeymen and then masters in their own right. And their work, the lead on the roof of a medieval cathedral, protected everything below it. The stone vaults, the timber roofs above the vaults, the painted ceilings, the wooden furnishings, the glass in the windows. Without the plumbers, the cathedrals would have been roofless ruins within a generation. Their names are in the account rolls for the most part. More so than the masons, oddly, because the plumber was a subcontractor, in a sense, a specialist brought in for specific operations, and his name and his fee were recorded more systematically than the daily wages of the mason's labourers. But they are not in the architectural histories. They are in the lead. Chapter 14. The geometry that survived in the collection of the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. There is a manuscript known as the Vienna Portfolio or the Regensburg Portfolio, consisting of architectural drawings on parchment dating to the late Gothic period, probably the early 15th century. The drawings are of Gothic architectural details, moulding profiles, window tracery, vault patterns. They are working drawings, the kind of documents that a master builder would use to communicate the design of specific elements to the craftsmen who were to build them. And alongside the drawings, there are geometrical constructions, step-by-step procedures illustrated graphically for deriving the proportions and profiles of specific architectural elements from a given starting dimension, using only compass and straightedge. These are the design methods of the Gothic tradition, written down. They are extraordinarily rare. The medieval master builders did not, in general, write down their methods. The secrecy of the craft militated against it. The practical transmission of knowledge through apprenticeship made it unnecessary, and the specific geometric character of the knowledge meant that it was, in some ways, easier to demonstrate than to describe in words. But a few documents survive that give us glimpses of the geometric systems that underpinned Gothic design. Matthias Rohritzer, a German master builder who became master of the Regensburg Cathedral workshops in 1477, published in 1486 a small pamphlet entitled Booklet Concerning Pinnacle Correctitude, which describes in step-by-step geometric terms how to proportion the elements of a Gothic pinnacle. The procedure begins with a square. From that square, successive geometric operations derive the proportions of every element of the pinnacle. The compass does everything. No numerical measurement is required. Rohritzer's booklet is remarkable, not just for its content, but for its existence. He was publishing trade secrets. He was making available to anyone who could read it a portion of the geometric knowledge that was supposed to be restricted to the initiated members of the craft. He probably paid a professional price for it. The craft organizations of the late medieval period took their secrecy seriously, and a master who published their methods was violating a fundamental obligation. But we have the booklet, and what it shows is that the geometric design system of the Gothic masters was real, was systematic, and was transmissible through a written text when someone chose to write it down. Similar documents survive from other parts of Europe. The Codex Palatinus Germanicus 570, another German manuscript, contains geometric design procedures for vault design. The sketchbook of Hans Boblinger, a late Gothic German master builder, contains proportioning systems for tower design. In England, no equivalent documents survive from the medieval operative tradition. This is not evidence that the English tradition was different. It is evidence that the English documents, if they ever existed, were destroyed or lost. But the English buildings follow the same geometric principles as the continental buildings for which documents do survive. The same sequences of geometric construction can be demonstrated in the proportioning of English Gothic buildings. The system was the same on both sides of the Channel. The documents that specified it on the English side are gone. The geometry, however, is in the stone. Read carefully enough. Any great Gothic building is its own document. The proportions record the design procedure. The ratios in the plan record the geometric construction that generated them. The profile of a moulding records the compass arcs that defined it. The master is encoded in the building, if you know how to decode it. Chapter 15. The pilgrimage roads and their makers. The cathedrals were not isolated buildings. They were nodes in a network of roads and paths and waterways that connected the principal shrines of Britain with each other and with the pilgrimage routes of the continent. And the network was not only the physical infrastructure of roads, it was a cultural infrastructure of hospitality and commerce and shared religious purpose that made it possible for large numbers of people to move across the country with some confidence of finding food and shelter and safety along the way. The pilgrimage roads are older than the cathedrals that were their destinations. Many of the routes that medieval pilgrims travelled to Canterbury or Durham or Glastonbury followed paths that had been in use for much longer. The Pilgrim's Way, which runs along the North Downs from Winchester to Canterbury, follows a route that archaeological evidence suggests was in use in the Bronze Age as a ridgetop track. The Ridgeway, which crosses the chalk uplands of southern England, is one of the oldest roads in Britain, in use for at least 5,000 years. The cathedrals were inserted into a pre-existing network of movement, and the network shaped how people understood the cathedrals. To go on pilgrimage was not simply to go from one place to another. It was to participate in a tradition of movement, of sacred journey, that had its own conventions and its own economy and its own social world. The pilgrims needed food and lodging. They needed to cross rivers at fords or bridges. They needed protection from robbery, or at least the social convention that pilgrims should be left unmolested, which was observed with varying reliability. They needed water. They needed the stone crosses that marked the route at intervals, telling them they were on the right path. All of this infrastructure required maintenance. The bridges were built and maintained by guilds and confraternities that understood bridge building as a pious act, a form of charity that facilitated pilgrimage. The hospices and hospitals along the routes were maintained by religious orders. The stone crosses were erected by local communities. The pilgrimage economy supported the cathedral construction campaigns. The offerings left at the shrines of the principal saints, Canterbury's Becket, Durham's Cuthbert, Chichester's Richard, Lincoln's Hugh, funded the fabric of the buildings. In good years, the shrine revenues were substantial. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury was, at its peak in the 13th century, one of the most profitable pilgrimage destinations in Northern Europe. The master builders knew this. The architectural decisions that created the pilgrimage circuits within the cathedrals, the wide ambulatories that allowed pilgrims to move around the choir without disturbing the liturgy, the raised shrines that gave the relic a commanding position in the space, The systems of lateral chapels that offered multiple secondary pilgrimage stops were designed with the pilgrim in mind as much as the canon. The cathedral was an experience, and the master builder was designing an experience as much as a structure. The sequence of spaces from nave to choir to sanctuary to shrine, each one different in character, each one preparing the pilgrim for the next, was choreographed, deliberately, by someone who understood that architecture is not just space, but sequence, not just volume, but time. We do not know who that person was. For most cathedrals, we do not even know their name, but the choreography is still there. Walk through a cathedral from west to east, and you will feel it, moving from the wide, horizontal spaciousness of the nave into the more vertical, more enclosed quality of the choir. Crossing the threshold of the crossing, where the four arms of the building intersect and the tower above, gives a sudden sense of vertical release. Moving into the sanctuary, where the altar is, and the whole building seems to converge. And then, at the eastern end, reaching the place where the shrine was, where the saint is, where the journey ends. The sequence was designed by a person whose name is gone. The experience they designed is not. Chapter 16. The Hidden Rooms. Most visitors to a medieval cathedral see a fraction of the building. They see the nave, the choir, the transepts, perhaps the chapter house and the cloister if these survive. They see what is at floor level, what is accessible without climbing stairs, what is formally open for public viewing. They do not see the triforium galleries, the narrow passages at mid-height in the walls that run above the main arcade and below the clerestory windows. They do not see the roof spaces above the stone vaults, dark and dusty attic zones that contain the timber structure carrying the lead roof. They do not see the bell chambers and the clock rooms and the winding stairs in the towers. They do not see the crypt chapels that are sometimes locked or unstaffed. They do not see the treasury, where the cathedral's accumulated movable heritage of plate and vestments and manuscripts is kept. And they do not see what is below the floor. The floors of medieval cathedrals are not the original floors, or rather, in some cases, the paving itself is original. But the level of the floor has risen over centuries as successive layers of paving and infill have accumulated. At Winchester, the original Norman floor level was below the current floor by a measurable amount, and Victorian-era investigations found the remains of the Norman marble, paving below the existing stone. Beneath the floor there are graves, hundreds of them at most major cathedrals. The floor of a medieval cathedral was prime burial real estate. The closer you were buried to the high altar, the holier the ground and the more efficacious the prayers said above you. The powerful and the wealthy paid for burial inside the cathedral. Over centuries of continuous use, the floor became layered with the dead. Archaeological investigation of cathedral floors, which typically happens when structural problems require intervention or when a specific research question is being addressed, consistently finds more material than was expected. At Winchester, the investigation following the discovery of structural problems in the late 19th century, which led to the extraordinary underwater underpinning work by the diver William Walker between 1906 and 1911, revealed a sequence of below-floor archaeology that added substantially to the understanding of the site's history. At Southwark Cathedral in London, which was formally elevated to cathedral status only in 1905, but has a medieval church that predates any existing London cathedral. Excavations associated with development in the 1990s found Saxon and Roman remains below the medieval floor levels that significantly extended the known history of the site. The triforium galleries, when they are accessible, are extraordinary spaces, half-lit, sometimes with open views down into the nave through the arcade openings, sometimes with views out over the town through windows in the outer wall. They were used in the medieval period for a variety of purposes. Some were used for storage, some were used as chapels, some housed the cathedral's archives or treasury on a temporary or permanent basis. At York Minster, the Triforium Gallery in the south transept has been opened to visitors as part of the cathedral's public interpretation programme. Walking through it gives a view of the nave from a height and an angle that completely transforms the experience of the space. The proportions read differently. The relationship between the arcade and the clerestory above becomes clear in a way that is difficult to understand from the floor. You can see the geometry of the building from inside the building. This is, in fact, the view that the medieval builders had when they were building. They were up in the walls, setting the stones, reading the geometry from within the structure. The view from the triforium is something close to the builder's view. From up there, you can see things that the official visitor route does not show you. The building becomes, from up there, less a finished object and more a living process. Something that was assembled piece by people standing more or less where you are standing now. You can almost hear the hammers. Chapter 17. The Gothic North. The great medieval cathedrals of northern England form a distinct group within the English Gothic tradition. Durham, York, Ripon, Beverley, Selby, Carlisle, Chester. These buildings share a regional character, a preference for certain materials and certain proportional approaches that reflects the cultural identity of the North, which was more politically and culturally distinct from the South in the medieval period than it is today. York Minster is the dominant figure in this northern group, the largest medieval building in Britain, the seat of the Archbishop of York, the second ecclesiastical province of England. Its building history spans from the early Norman period to the completion of the nave in the early 15th century, a period of roughly 300 years during which successive master builders, most of them unknown, added to and modified the building in response to changing liturgical needs, changing architectural fashion, and the specific crises, fires, and structural failures and political disruptions that are part of the history of any very large building over a very long period. The Five Sisters window in York's north transept, 5 narrow lancet windows filled with grisaille glass, grey and silver tones, dating to around 1250, is one of the most beautiful things in English Gothic architecture. The restraint of the design, the refusal of colour, the reliance on pattern and form alone is as sophisticated in its way as the most polychrome window at Canterbury. But York's most astonishing architectural achievement is the nave. The York nave, built in the second half of the 14th century, is the widest Gothic nave in England, at 31 metres from wall to wall, wider even than Canterbury, wider than Winchester. The width creates a spatial experience quite unlike any other English cathedral interior. The nave does not feel tall in the way that Canterbury or Amiens feels tall. It feels wide, horizontal rather than vertical, a different kind of grandeur. And the west front of York, with its twin towers framing the great west window, is the most theatrical of all the great English cathedral facades. The west window, installed in the 1330s and called the Heart of Yorkshire because of a tracery pattern in its upper zone that resembles a stylized heart, fills the entire space between the towers with light. At certain times of day, and especially in the early morning, when the sun is low in the east and lights the nave from behind, the window glows from within. The master who designed the York nave is unknown. He may be the master whose design work is identifiable at other northern sites of the same period. The stylistic comparison of architectural details, the specific profiles of the mouldings, the handling of the pier capitals, the geometry of the window tracery, is one of the primary methods by which architectural historians attempt to reconstruct the careers of individual medieval builders. This method is uncertain. It assumes that stylistic consistency is the product of a single guiding mind, rather than of a shared workshop tradition, or of craftsmen following the same pattern books, or simply the same fashions of the day. It is a detective method, probabilistic rather than demonstrative, and its conclusions are always open to revision as new evidence emerges. But it is what we have. The stone is the evidence. The stone is the record, and the stone at York is extraordinary. Chapter 18. Wells in winter. Go to Wells Cathedral in January. The tourists are mostly gone. The city is quiet. The cathedral close, that enclosed precinct of medieval buildings around the cathedral, has a stillness in the grey light of midwinter that is quite unlike its busy summer self. Inside the cathedral, the light is different in winter. Lower in the sky, the sun enters the nave windows at a shallower angle, and the light that comes through the medieval glass in the choir is more raked, more directional, falling in long bands across the stone floor in a way that reveals the texture of the paving. And in the nave, there are the scissors, arches. The scissors, arches of Wells Cathedral are one of the most discussed and most argued over architectural interventions in English medieval architecture. They were inserted into the crossing in 1338, after the central tower showed signs of structural distress, probably because the foundations were settling unevenly under the load of the tower. 3 enormous arches were built into the 3 arched openings of the crossing, each arch springing from the base of one opening and rising to the opposite upper corner, creating a figure that looks, from the nave, like 2 arches crossing each other, or like a pair of open scissors. They were, in structural terms, successful. The tower still stands. The arches have been carrying their load for nearly 700 years. But they were and remain aesthetically controversial. They are undeniably bizarre. They interrupt the longitudinal perspective of the cathedral in a way that no other element does. Standing in the nave and looking east through the choir, you see not the clear view to the high altar that most English cathedrals offer, but these extraordinary crossing forms, simultaneously structural and sculptural, that stop the eye and redirect it in ways the original design never intended. Some people find them magnificent. Some find them disturbing. Few people are indifferent to them. The master who designed them, tentatively identified by some researchers as William Joy, a master mason documented at Wells in the 1330s, was facing a genuine structural emergency and produced a solution that was at once entirely functional and entirely original. There is no precedent for the scissors arches in English or continental Gothic architecture. They were invented in the moment of crisis by someone who understood the forces involved well enough to know that a large arch spanning from base to upper corner would distribute the load of the tower in the required way. He was right. The arches work. The aesthetic controversy that has surrounded them ever since is, from a structural engineering perspective, beside the point. The tower is still standing. The arches are still holding it. That was the brief. Chapter 19. The earth beneath Gloucester Cathedral is famous for 2 things above all others. The first is the tomb of Edward II, the English king murdered at Berkeley Castle in 1327. Whose tomb was placed in the cathedral by his son, Edward III, and which became a major pilgrimage destination that funded the transformation of the cathedral's architectural character over the following decades. The second is the invention of the perpendicular Gothic style. The south transept of Gloucester Cathedral, remodelled in the 1330s using revenues from the Edward II pilgrimage, is the first known example of the perpendicular style, the final, and in some ways most typically English phase of the Gothic tradition. The perpendicular is characterized by its emphasis on vertical and horizontal lines, the systematic subdivision of wall and window, surfaces by vertical tracery bars that run from floor to vault, and the use of panel tracery in which the glass is subdivided into rectangular panels rather than the flowing, curvilinear patterns of the preceding decorated style. The perpendicular style spread from Gloucester across England over the following century and a half, eventually producing the fan vaults of King's College Chapel and Henry VII's Chapel at Westminster Abbey. It is the style in which most English people, if asked to think of a Gothic church, will visualize, and it was invented in the south transept of Gloucester Cathedral in the 1330s. Who invented it? We do not know. William Ramsay, a royal master mason who was the most prominent English architectural figure of the 1330s, has been suggested. The design of the Gloucester south transept shares characteristics with work documented at other sites associated with Ramsay. But the attribution is not conclusive, and beneath the perpendicular transformation of Gloucester Cathedral, and beneath the Norman Romanesque of the original building, begun in 1089, and beneath the Saxon minster that preceded it on the same site, there is the earth. Archaeological excavations at Gloucester have found Roman period material below the cathedral, consistent with the presence of a significant Roman building on the site. Gloucester, Roman glevum, was a colonia, one of the highest status categories of Roman settlement, a town originally founded for retired legionaries. It had a substantial public buildings program. Something significant stood here in the Roman period. Below the Roman period, Iron Age material has been found in the vicinity, suggesting occupation of the area before the Roman conquest. The continuity of significant human activity on this particular piece of ground, from the pre-Roman period through Roman and Saxon and Norman and medieval to the present, is another example of the pattern we have seen at Winchester, Canterbury, York, and many other sites. The cathedrals stand at the intersection of long histories of human attention to specific locations. The location was chosen before the cathedral. The cathedral was built because people had already, for thousands of years, been coming to this place. Chapter 20. The Stone That Spoke. Let us come back, at the end, to where we started, to the man in the wall at Beverley. He scratched himself into a stone, because he could not write his name, and because he would not be in any other record, and because the building would stand after him, and he wanted something of himself to stand with it. He wanted to be there. In some small, human, completely understandable way, he wanted to be remembered. He was not, but his picture survived. The cathedrals of Britain are full of these small survivals. The mason's marks cut into the stones in the dark corners. The individual quirk of a capital carving that tells you this was the work of a particular hand on a particular day. The slight irregularity in a vault rib that records the moment when someone made an adjustment, corrected an error, decided that this stone rather than that one should go in this position. The buildings are full of people, not the people the plaques remember, not the bishops and the kings and the wealthy donors whose effigies lie under their canopied tombs in the choir. The other people, the ones who made the actual choices about what the building would be, how it would feel, what it would do to you when you walked inside it. The master builder who decided that the nave should be 10 bays long rather than 8, and that this decision would give the interior a particular rhythm, a particular sense of deep perspective, that a shorter nave would not have. The carver who, working on a capital in the north transept, where the lighting would always be dim and the carving would never receive much attention, carved an owl with such specific, such observed detail that it is clearly not an imaginary owl, but an owl the carver had seen and studied and remembered. The glazier who mixed the colours for a particular window and achieved a blue that is slightly different from the blue in any other window in the building, a blue that catches the morning light in a specific way, at a specific time of year, that was probably not planned, but that has been moving people who notice it for 700 years. The apprentice who swept the lodge floor at the end of every day, and who eventually became a journeyman, and then a master, and who built his own buildings, and whose name is lost, along with his master's name, and his master's master's name, in the long chain of transmission that produced the tradition that produced the building. All of them are here, in the stone, in the glass, in the timber above the vault and the lead on the roof, in the specific handling of every surface and every joint and every transition from one element to another. The cathedrals were not built by the bishops. They were built by the anonymous. the invisible, the unnamed, by people who had no other way to leave a mark on the world except to make the mark as well as they possibly could, and trust that the mark would last. It lasted. 900 years, in many cases, 800, 700. The specific choices that specific people made, whose names we will never know, are still there, still organizing your experience of the building, still doing what they were made to do, still making the stone speak. Chapter 21. The tradition continues. There is a peculiarity of Exeter Cathedral that I want to close with before we let the night settle. In the cathedral's collection, there is a small wooden object. It is roughly rectangular, about 40 centimeters long, made of oak, and it is covered on one side with scratched geometric lines. It is a template, a working drawing, not on parchment or on paper, but on wood. A piece of wood that was used, probably in the early 14th century, to guide the cutting of a specific moulding profile, somewhere in the cathedral. The craftsman scratched the profile of the moulding onto the wood, and then used the wood as a pattern to guide his chisel when he was cutting the actual stone. Thousands of such templates were made and used in the course of building Exeter Cathedral. Almost all of them were thrown away when they were no longer needed, or burned for firewood, or simply rotted away over the centuries. This one survived, probably by accident, preserved in some dry corner of the cathedral, where conditions happened to be favourable. It is one of the most extraordinary objects in the collection of any English cathedral. Not because it is beautiful, it is not beautiful, it is a scratched piece of wood, but because it is a direct, unmediated physical connection to the act of building, to the moment when a specific craftsman, at a specific point in the construction of Exeter Cathedral, made a specific decision about how a moulding should look. He scratched it on the wood. The wood is still here. The moulding is in the cathedral wall. The craftsman is gone. But between the template and the moulding, you can trace the arc of the gesture that connected them. The same hand moved from one to the other. The same mind that decided the profile was right scratched it here and cut it there. A template is a template. It is designed to be used and discarded. It is not meant to survive. The craftsman who made it would be astonished to know that it was still in existence 700 years later in a glass case in the cathedral that his handiwork helped to build. He would perhaps also be pleased. He made it as well as it needed to be made. He got the profile right. The moulding in the wall is the same as the profile on the wood. The work was done correctly. The building stands. That was the job. It was done. Rest now. Let the stone settle around you. Let the vaults bear their weight in the dark. Let the glass hold the night behind it, and the lid on the roof hold the weather off, and the mortar between the stones hold everything together, the way it has been holding everything together for longer than anyone now living can remember. The builders are in the walls. Their work is carrying you. Sleep well. Outro. You have been inside the walls tonight, inside the silence that surrounds the names in the guidebooks, inside the knowledge that was passed from master to apprentice and never written down until some brave German published a small pamphlet in 1486 that disclosed, for the first time, what the compass was doing. Inside the traditions that traced themselves back to Egypt and to Euclid and to the antediluvian patriarchs, because the men who held them understood they were holding something old. We went looking for the people history forgot. We found them in the masons' marks scratched on stones in dark corners. In the account rolls that record a labour dispute in 14th century Exeter, and a woman paid for carrying sand, and a carpenter, whose medical expenses were covered after a fall. In the wooden template in the Exeter collection, in the small drawing of a resting man scratched into a wall at Beverley Minster by a hand that is 700 years gone. We found the sacred geography that preceded the cathedrals, the springs and the alignments and the pre-Christian sites that Gregory told Augustine to incorporate rather than destroy, because the sacredness of those places was older than any religion and more durable than any instruction to abandon it. We found the geometric tradition that made the buildings possible, encoded in the stone, recoverable by careful analysis, consistent across the whole of the Gothic world, traced by the masters themselves to sources they could not fully identify. And we found the tradition's end, the dissolution, the fires of Reformation iconoclasm, the closing of the workshops, the loss of the documents, the thinning of the chain of transmission until it was almost but not quite broken. Almost but not quite. Because the buildings are still there, and the builders are in the buildings, and if you know how to look, you can find them. Good night. Chapter 22. The Relic and the Building. There is a relationship between the relics inside English medieval cathedrals and the buildings that house them that is so close, so defining, that you cannot really understand one without understanding the other. The relic came first. Before the cathedral, before even the earliest church on a site, there was almost always the body, or part of a body, or an object associated with a holy person. The physical remains of a saint, which the medieval church understood as continuing to possess, after death, the miraculous powers that the saint had exercised in life. The theology of relics is one that modern secular culture finds difficult to engage with seriously, and this is unfortunate, because without engaging with it seriously, you cannot understand the medieval-built world. The relic was not merely a symbol. It was not a representation of the saint's holiness, the way a painting is a representation of a person. It was, in the medieval theological understanding, a continuation of the saint's physical presence in the world. The flesh and bones of a holy man or woman retained their connection to the divine because of the holiness that had animated them in life. To touch the relic, or to be in the same space as the relic, was to be in some meaningful proximity to sanctity. This is why pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles on foot, not to see a beautiful building, not to appreciate medieval architecture, to be near the saint, to ask the saint for help, to offer thanks for help already received. And this is why the buildings were built the way they were built. Every architectural decision in a cathedral that housed a major pilgrimage shrine was made in light of the relic. The direction of the building's axis, the arrangement of its spaces, the circuit of movement that pilgrims would follow from entrance to shrine, the lighting of the shrine chapel, the height of the shrine base, the visibility of the relic container from different positions in the building, all of these were functions of the relic's requirements. At Durham, the shrine of St. Cuthbert determined everything. The Galilee Chapel at the west end, the 9 altars at the east end, the specific arrangement of the choir, the position and dimensions of the ferretry, where the shrine stood, all of these were responses to the specific requirements of housing the most important relic of the north of England. At Canterbury, the shrine of Thomas Becket, which stood in the Trinity Chapel until its destruction by Henry VIII's commissioners in 1538, determined the entire eastern end of the cathedral. The Trinity Chapel was built specifically to house it. The ambulatory around the chapel was built to manage the pilgrims coming to visit it. The windows depicting Becket's miracles were placed there to be seen by the pilgrims in the specific sequence in which they would encounter them while moving around the ambulatory. The building was a machine for presenting the relic to pilgrims when the relics were destroyed at the Reformation, which they were systematically. The logic of the buildings was disrupted. The shrines were smashed, the relics were burned or thrown away, the pilgrimage traffic stopped. The buildings that had been designed around the relic were left standing, magnificent and empty of their central purpose. The cathedrals that we visit today are buildings from which the heart has been removed. They are extraordinarily beautiful. They are architecturally extraordinary. But the thing they were built to serve, the thing that determined every major architectural decision in their design, is gone. We are visiting the reliquary without the relic. The master builder who designed the Trinity Chapel at Canterbury was designing a container for Thomas Becket. The designer of the ferretry at Durham was designing a container for Cuthbert. The spatial logic of those buildings only fully makes sense in the context of what they were containing. When you understand this, the buildings become more interesting, not less. The absence of the relic makes the reliquary visible in a way it might not be if the relic were still there, drawing all the attention to itself. You can see the container clearly. You can read the architectural decisions that were made to serve the relic. And from those decisions, you can reconstruct something of the logic of a world that believed, with complete seriousness, that the bones of a dead man could cure blindness. That is a different world from our own, and the buildings are its most complete surviving monument. Chapter 23. The Chapter House and the Democracy. The Chapter House. It is the one space in a cathedral complex that is, in its essential function, not about the congregation and not about the pilgrims. It is about the community that ran the building. Every cathedral had a chapter, a body of clergy, responsible for the governance of the cathedral's religious and economic life. In a monastic cathedral, the chapter was the community of monks under the prior. In a secular cathedral, the chapter was a body of canons, the senior clergy of the cathedral's foundation. The chapter met regularly in the chapter house, a specific room or building adjacent to the cathedral, to conduct the business of the institution. Appointments were made, disputes were settled, financial decisions were taken, disciplinary matters were heard. The day-to-day governance of a major medieval religious institution was a substantial administrative operation, and it required a dedicated space. And the chapter houses of English cathedrals are among the most architecturally inventive spaces in medieval Britain. The English preferred for chapter houses a polygonal plan, octagonal, decagonal, sometimes with a central column. This preference for the polygon over the simpler rectangle appears consistently across English cathedral architecture from the late 12th century onward, and the results are some of the most beautiful spaces in any English building. Lincoln's chapter house, decagonal with a central pier, dates to the early 13th century. Salisbury's octagonal chapter house, later in the same century, is covered with a vault whose ribs spring from the central column in a pattern of elegant complexity. Southwell Minster's chapter house from the 1290s is decorated with a programme of naturalistic foliage carving. The leaves of hawthorn and oak and ivy and maple, rendered with such botanical accuracy that individual species can be identified. That is among the finest decorative sculptural programmes in England. York's chapter house, which is octagonal with no central column, spanning the entire space with a vault of timber rather than stone, is the largest unsupported Gothic interior in England. The solution to the spanning problem, which was considerable given that the chamber is roughly 17 metres in diameter, was to use timber rather than stone, and to design the timber structure as a compound of radiating ribs in the manner of a stone vault, but with the much lighter material. The result is technically ingenious and spatially remarkable, and the function of these spaces was democratic in a way that medieval life rarely was. The chapter met as a body. Each canon or monk had a seat in the chapter house, arranged around the perimeter, with the presiding officer at one end. Business was conducted in a formal but relatively egalitarian way compared to the hierarchical structure of the liturgy in the cathedral church itself. In the chapter house, the chapter as a collective body had real authority. Decisions were made by the chapter, not imposed from above. This is not modern democracy. The canons were all clergy, all men, all members of a specific educational and social elite. But within that elite, the chapter house was a space of collective self-governance, of deliberation and decision-making by a body rather than by an individual. The architecture reflects this. The polygonal plan with seating around the walls gives everyone the same relationship to the center of the room. The visual equality of the members of the chapter in their physical space reflects the formal equality of their voices in the chapter's deliberations. Someone understood this when they designed the English chapter house. Someone made the deliberate choice to build a space that embodied, in its geometry, the principle of collective governance. We do not know who that someone was, but they made a very specific decision, and the decision produced a distinctive architectural type, the English polygonal chapter house, that has no real equivalent elsewhere in the Gothic world. The decision is in the stone. The person who made it is not. Chapter 24. The problem of the spandrel. There is a technical problem that every Gothic cathedral builder faced, and how they solved it tells you something fundamental about how they thought. The problem of the spandrel. A spandrel is the roughly triangular area of wall between two adjacent arches and the horizontal line above them. In a nave arcade, the spandrels are the spaces between the arch heads and the triforium string course above. They are structurally complex zones where the forces from the arches are being redirected through the wall and where the wall thickness needs to be carefully managed to carry those forces efficiently. In early Romanesque architecture, the spandrels were thick and solid. They were the primary structural element carrying the loads from above. The wall was massive, and the spandrel was a critical part of its mass. As the Gothic style developed and walls became thinner and windows larger, the spandrel became a problem. You could not simply remove wall from the spandrel as you might wish to, because the structural forces were flowing through it. But you needed to reduce the dead weight of the wall to minimize the loads on the foundations and to allow the building to rise higher. The solution that the Gothic builders developed was the use of rubble infill with thin stone skins. The spandrel wall was not solid stone throughout. It was a skin of thin ashlar, fine squared stonework, on the inside face and the outside face, with a core of rough rubble and lime mortar between. This construction was much lighter than solid ashlar while maintaining sufficient strength. But the ratio of skin thickness to core depth and the quality of the rubble and mortar had to be carefully managed. Too thin a skin and the masonry would eventually fail. Too rough a core and the mortar would not bond properly. Too weak a lime and the whole thing would slowly deteriorate. The medieval builders managed these trade-offs by experience and by observation of what had worked in previous buildings. They had no material testing laboratory. They had no structural calculations for rubble core walls. What they had was the accumulated empirical knowledge of generations of builders who had built walls, watched some of them fail, and understood from the failures what the limits of the system were. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was practical, specific, and perishable. It lived in the hands of the craftsmen who mixed the mortar and laid the stones and tapped the faces and listened to the sound of the wall to understand how it was behaving. It was transmitted by apprenticeship, by standing next to a master and watching him do it and being told, like this, not like that, by making mistakes and having the master correct them, by the long, slow process of building enough walls that the knowledge became automatic, became part of the body's knowledge rather than the mind's knowledge. When the master died, the knowledge was in his apprentices. When the apprentices died, it was in theirs. The chain of transmission was the knowledge. And when the chain broke, at the Reformation and the dissolution, the knowledge did not instantly disappear, but it thinned. It was no longer being constantly refreshed by new practitioners, learning it at the feet of those who had learned it, at the feet of those who had learned it in the very buildings that the knowledge had produced. The Victorian restorers who worked on medieval cathedrals in the 19th century, men like George Gilbert Scott and John Loughborough Pearson, studied the buildings intensely. They could see what the medieval builders had done. They could, with effort, understand how they had done it. But they could not fully reproduce the process by which the knowledge had been created, because the process was apprenticeship. And what apprenticeship creates is a kind of knowledge that is not fully recoverable from observation alone. The Victorian restorations are good. Some of them are very good, but connoisseurs can usually tell them from the originals. Something is different. The spandrel knows. Chapter 25. The gargoyle's view from the top of a Gothic cathedral, looking out over the city from a height of 50 or 60 or 100 feet. The world looks completely different. The gargoyle sees this view all the time. Gargoyles, the carved stone waterspouts that project from the walls of Gothic cathedrals to carry rainwater away from the base of the walls, are among the most familiar and most strange features of the Gothic tradition. They project from the building at parapet level, often carved in the form of fantastic creatures, and the water runs through a channel in their bodies and exits from their open mouths, arcing away from the wall in a jet that lands clear of the foundation. Their function is entirely practical. Without them, the rainwater running down the outside of the wall would collect at the base and soak into the foundations, with long-term damage to both the foundations and the wall above. The gargoyle is a drainage solution, but the gargoyles of English cathedrals are not merely functional, they are carved, with specificity and with invention. The bestiary of gargoyles on a major Gothic cathedral includes monsters, demons, hybrid creatures, animals, and sometimes apparently realistic portraits of human beings. They are carved by craftsmen who had both the technical skill to carve at a high level and the freedom, apparently, to invent their own subjects within broad conventions. The gargoyles are, in a sense, the place where the medieval carver's imagination was given most freedom. The capitals and the portals and the choir stalls were carved to programs, with specific theological or iconographic requirements that the carver had to follow. The gargoyle had to be a waterspout. Beyond that, almost anything went. And the carvers knew that the gargoyles, high on the exterior of the building, would be seen from below and from a distance. The details that mattered at close range, the subtleties of expression, the specific rendering of fur or feather or scale, would be invisible from the ground. What mattered was the silhouette, the gesture, the overall shape of the creature against the sky. The gargoyle carvers understood their audience. They designed for the view from below, for the glance upward from the street, for the way the creature's shape would read against the grey English sky. They thought about what the viewer would see, and they carved for that. This is sophisticated. It is the same kind of thinking that went into every other element of the cathedral design. The understanding that architecture is not about the building itself, but about the experience of the building, which happens at specific distances and specific angles and in specific conditions of light. The man who carved the gargoyle on the north side of the Lincoln nave, somewhere in the early 13th century, was thinking about you. Not you specifically, but the person who would stand in the street below and look up. He was thinking about how his creature would appear from that position, at that distance, in that quality of northern English light. He was designing an experience. And the experience is still there. Look up at the gargoyles. They are looking back at you. Chapter 26. What the ground-penetrating radar found. Modern archaeology has tools that the builders of the medieval cathedrals could not have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measures the reflections that come back when those pulses encounter changes in the density or composition of the material underground. Different materials, stone and mortar, and disturbed soil and undisturbed soil reflect the radar signal differently. By analyzing the pattern of reflections, a trained operator can build up a picture of what is below the surface without digging. In the last 30 years, ground-penetrating radar has been applied to the floors and the immediate surroundings of several major English cathedrals, with results that have consistently surprised the researchers. At Winchester, radar surveys of the nave floor in the 1990s detected the outlines of the Norman period floor structure below the current Victorian paving including the positions of the original column bases. At Hereford Cathedral, radar surveys have detected previously unknown wall foundations and floor surfaces below the current cathedral floor, extending the documented building sequence on the site. At Gloucester, radar surveys carried out as part of research into the cathedral's post-medieval architectural history detected what appeared to be a previously unknown stone structure below the nave floor, whose nature and date were not immediately determinable from the radar signal alone, but which was clearly an architectural feature of some significance. At Norwich Cathedral, radar surveys carried out in the early 2000s detected the outlines of what appears to be an earlier church below the present building, predating the Norman cathedral, begun in 1096, and potentially representing a Saxon minster whose existence had been inferred from documentary sources, but not confirmed archaeologically. What these surveys are doing is recovering the lost archaeology beneath buildings that were built and rebuilt over centuries on top of what came before. They are recovering the palimpsest that we described at the beginning, the layers of the past that are buried under the present. And each time they recover a new layer, the story gets deeper. The list of things that were here before the building we can see gets longer. The list of decisions that were made by people whose names are not in any record gets longer. The ground-penetrating radar is doing what the mason who scratched his picture in the Beverley Wall was trying to do. It is finding the people in the walls, not with memory or with archives, because those have mostly been destroyed, with electromagnetic pulses and computer analysis. The technology changes, the question remains the same. Who was here? What did they know? What did they build? The answers keep coming back from the dark below the floor, incrementally, incompletely, in the language of radar reflections that trained eyes can read. The Earth has a long memory. We are only beginning to learn to listen to it. Chapter 27. The last chapter. We have come a long way tonight. From the scratched picture in a Beverley Wall to the radar pulses moving through the earth beneath Winchester. From Augustine, landing in Kent in 597 CE, to the Saxon and Roman layers beneath the Saxon layer, and whatever was beneath that. From the anonymous master builders of the Norman cathedrals, to William of Sens and his fall from the scaffolding, and William the Englishman who finished what he began. From the geometric design methods of the Gothic lodge, to the specific template in the Exeter collection that shows us, in a piece of scratched wood, the direct trace of a craftsman's hand. What have we learned? We have learned that the story of who built the cathedrals is much more complex than the story that puts the bishop at the centre. The bishop commissioned, the bishop funded, or raised the funds. The bishop's name is in the records, but the bishop did not design the building. He did not know how to set out a vault. He did not know how to calculate the thrust line of a flying buttress. He did not know what proportion of lime to sand would produce a mortar that would set properly in the damp climate of northern England. The people who knew these things are mostly nameless. They are in the buildings, not in the records. We have learned that the sacred geography of Britain, the system of springs and hilltops and river confluences and landscape alignments that underpins the location of virtually every major medieval cathedral, is not a medieval creation. It is old, much older than any historical record, and the medieval bishops who built their cathedrals on these sites were, consciously or not, building on a tradition of sacred geography that reached back into the prehistoric past. We have learned that the knowledge the builders possessed, the geometric methods, the structural intuitions, the craft traditions, was real and effective and sophisticated, and that it was transmitted through a system of apprenticeship and fraternal obligation that was, by design, secretive. And we have learned that the buildings themselves are the primary archive. The stone is the record. The proportions and the geometry and the structural forms and the moulding profiles are the evidence, imperfect but durable, of what the builders knew and how they thought. The buildings are still standing, the evidence is still there. And every year, with ground-penetrating radar, and with dendrochronology, and with the careful analysis of moulding profiles, and with the reading of account rolls that nobody has read since the 14th century, the picture gets slightly clearer, slightly less anonymous, slightly more human. The man in the Beverley Wall is still resting inside his stone. He has been waiting a long time to be found. Go quietly, let him rest, and let the buildings carry you into the night. Good night. Chapter 28. The Stained Glass Surveyors. There is a register maintained in Britain called the National Inventory of Medieval Stained Glass. It is an attempt, now many decades in the making, to locate, photograph, describe, and analyse every surviving piece of medieval stained glass in England. The task is larger than it might appear, because medieval glass survives not only in the great cathedrals, but in parish churches across the country, in fragments, often too small or too damaged to attract obvious attention, in windows that have been reused and rearranged and supplemented with later glass over the centuries, until the original medieval portions are not immediately obvious to an untrained eye. The register has found medieval glass in places nobody expected, in small village churches in Lincolnshire and Shropshire, where nobody had thought to look carefully, in windows where the medieval fragments had been used as patching material for later glass, in architectural salvage collections assembled by Victorian restorers who removed medieval glass from churches they were restoring and stored it pending reinstallation that in many cases never happened. Every fragment they find is evidence of a workshop, of a craftsman who mixed the glass batch that produced that specific colour, of a painter who applied the vitreous enamel to render the face or the drapery or the inscription, of a glazier who cut the glass to shape and assembled the panel in lead. The fragments are more informative than they appear. The specific composition of medieval glass, the particular mixture of ingredients that produced its colour, has been analysed in detail using X-ray fluorescence and other non-destructive chemical analysis techniques. The results show that glass from specific workshops, in specific regions and specific periods, has a characteristic chemical signature. It is possible, in principle, to identify the origin of a piece of glass from its chemistry, in the same way that the origin of copper tools can be identified from their trace element composition. This research has revealed something unexpected. The production of English medieval glass was, in certain periods, dominated by a surprisingly small number of workshops. The intense, rich colours of the glass in the Trinity Chapel, windows at Canterbury, for example, have been linked by chemical analysis to a production tradition that appears to have connections with workshops in the Loire Valley of France. The glass was not simply English, it was, in its production, connected to a continental tradition that was itself the product of specific craft knowledge held in specific workshops. The knowledge of how to make a particular shade of medieval ruby glass, the process of flashing a thin layer of red glass onto clear glass to produce a translucency that solid red glass could not achieve, was a trade secret of specific workshops. When those workshops closed, the knowledge of how to make that specific colour, with its specific depth and its specific behaviour in different qualities of light, was lost. The Victorians who made glass for the restoration of medieval buildings in the 19th century could not reproduce the medieval colours exactly. They could come close. But close is not the same. The medieval glass is irreplaceable, not because glass cannot be made. Of course glass can be made. But because the specific knowledge that produced the medieval colours existed in specific minds, in specific workshops that no longer exist. And when those minds were gone, the knowledge went with them. This is the recurring theme. The buildings survive. The knowledge that made them does not. The buildings are evidence of a knowledge that is mostly unrecoverable. We can see what they knew, We can partially understand how they achieved it. We cannot fully recover the process by which they came to know it, or by which they transmitted it. The glass holds the light differently at noon than at dusk. At dusk, the ruby deepens. The blue goes almost black. The gold becomes amber. The medieval glazier knew this. He designed for it. He knew how his window would behave at every time of day and in every season of the year, because he had lived with glass all his working life and had watched enough windows in enough conditions to understand it. We are still learning to see what he already knew by heart. Chapter 29. The Font and the Foundation. At the entrance to almost every medieval cathedral, before you reach the nave, there is a font, not always prominently positioned, sometimes to one side, sometimes in a screened-off baptistry, sometimes in a dedicated chapel, but near the entrance, near the threshold between outside and inside, at the point of entry. The font contains water. This is not accidental. Baptism, the ritual of water immersion or anointing that marks entry into the Christian community, is the first of the sacraments. The font, which contains the water of baptism, is placed at the entrance to the church because it marks the threshold of the Christian life. You enter the church, literally and spiritually, through the water of the font. But fonts in English medieval churches also, very frequently, sit above or near natural water sources, or they are positioned to receive light from specific windows at specific times, or they are located at the intersection of specific compass directions that carry cosmological meaning in the design of the building. The water of the font is not theologically equivalent to the water of the sacred spring that was at the site before the cathedral, but it is in that position in the building, and the water of the sacred spring did not stop flowing when the cathedral was built above it. At Canterbury, the spring water that Gervase of Canterbury mentions in his account of the 1174 fire that had to be managed in the course of the rebuilding was incorporated into the drainage of the rebuilt choir. At Wells, the springs that give the city its name were managed, from the early medieval period, by an elaborate system of channels and pools that served both the cathedral and the bishop's palace. At Winchester, the chalk aquifer that makes the crypt flood in wet winters is the same water body that made this site significant in the pre-Christian period. The font is the surviving visible form of a relationship between sacred building and sacred water that goes back to the very beginning of human religious practice at these sites. The medieval builders knew they were building on water. The documentary evidence of foundation engineering at most major English cathedrals shows awareness of the water table and efforts to manage it. The pile foundations at Winchester, the unusual methods used at Salisbury to distribute loads across the waterlogged ground of the Avon floodplain, the care taken at Norwich to establish solid foundations above the groundwater level of the Wensum Valley, all of these are responses to the specific hydrological conditions of sites chosen, long before any cathedral was planned, partly because of their water. The water is still there, under every cathedral, under the font, under the nave, under the foundations that rest on whatever was laid down before the Normans came, and before the Saxons, and before the Romans, and before whoever it was that first walked to this confluence of streams, or this rise above the water table, and felt that it was a place where something could happen that could not happen somewhere else. The water was the beginning. The font is the memory of the beginning. The cathedral is what was built over the beginning, by people who understood, in different languages and different theologies in different centuries, that the beginning was real. Chapter 30. Silence and Stone. One final observation before we let the night take over. A medieval cathedral, heard before it is seen, has a specific acoustic. The stone walls and the stone vault and the stone floor create a reverberation that is quite unlike any other built space. Sound takes time to die in a Gothic cathedral. The reverberation time, which is the time for a sound to decay to inaudibility after the source stops, is measured in seconds. For a large Gothic cathedral, reverb times of 5, 6, 7 seconds are common. This means that a sound, a choir singing, an organ playing, a single voice speaking, continues to fill the space for several seconds after the source has finished. Sound overlaps with itself. The beginning of one phrase is still sounding when the next phrase begins. Music composed for Gothic cathedrals, the plain chant that the medieval monks sang in their stone churches, was composed to work with this acoustic. The long, sustained notes of Gregorian chant, the slow movement from one pitch to another, the lack of rapid ornament or complex rhythm. These characteristics are acoustically appropriate for a space where fast music would become a smear of overlapping sound. The medieval builders understood the acoustic of their buildings. They had heard stone churches before they built one. They knew what a stone vault did to sound. They designed for it. And the acoustic is, in a sense, the most invisible and the most present element of the medieval cathedral experience. You cannot photograph it. You cannot draw it. It is not in the archives. But when you stand in a great medieval cathedral and hear the choir sing, you are hearing the acoustic that the medieval builders designed, standing in a space whose proportions were partly determined by the desire to create a specific kind of sound. The reverberation is the ghost of the builder. It echoes in the space he made, shaped by the surfaces he specified, the stone he chose, the vault profile he derived from his compass, and his geometric knowledge. He is in the sound, in the way the sound dies, in the last trace of a note as it fades into the stone and is absorbed. And then silence. The silence of a cathedral is its own sound, not absence but presence. The stone holding the last vibrations of what was just sung, holding the memory of 800 years of singing, of every voice that has ever filled this space, settling now into quiet. The man in the Beverley wall scratched himself into the stone because he wanted to persist. He has, in the stone, in the sound, in the specific quality of the silence that follows the last note. He is there. They are all there. Rest now. Let the stone hold the night. Good night. Chapter 31. The names we do have. Before we close entirely, it is worth dwelling briefly on the exceptions, on the handful of names that did make it through the silence. Richard of Stowe is documented as master mason at Lincoln Cathedral in the 1290s. He appears in the cathedral fabric rolls at a specific weekly wage. He is associated with the Angel Choir, the eastern extension of the cathedral, built to house the shrine of St. Hugh. The Angel Choir is one of the most perfect Gothic spaces in England, its carved stone angels looking down from the triforium with an expression that architectural historians struggle to describe in ways that do not become faintly absurd. Serene, attentive, present in a way that carved stone has no right to be. Richard of Stowe made the decision to place those angels where they are. He chose the scale of the carving in relation to the size of the space. He understood that the figures needed to be large enough to read from the floor below, but not so large that they overpowered the architectural context. He got the balance exactly right. He is in the fabric rolls as a weekly wage. Hugh Herland, the royal master carpenter, whose work at Westminster Hall we discussed earlier, is one of the most completely documented medieval English building craftsmen. His career can be traced from the 1360s through to his death, probably in the early 15th century. He worked on a series of major royal commissions. His design drawings for Westminster Hall survive. His wages are recorded over decades in the royal building accounts. He is, compared to almost all of his contemporaries in the building trades, extraordinarily visible. And his Westminster Hall roof is still standing, the widest medieval timber span in the world, the crown of the entire English medieval carpentry tradition. Henry Yeverley. His name is worth knowing because he represents, more than any other individual, the full achievement of the English Gothic masonry tradition. Active from the 1350s to his death in 1400, Yvel was the king's master mason for most of the reign of Edward III and throughout the reign of Richard II. He worked on an extraordinary range of commissions. The nave of Canterbury Cathedral, rebuilt in the Perpendicular style in the later 14th century, is largely his design. He worked on the Tower of London. He designed the tomb of Edward III in Westminster Abbey. He was a wealthy man by the time of his death. He owned property in London. He had made a career from his craft that gave him a social standing unusual for a craftsman in the medieval period. And his Canterbury nave, that long perpendicular interior, with its slender piers and its simple panel vaults, and its extraordinary sense of controlled, disciplined light, is still the most successful piece of architectural design in Canterbury Cathedral. He knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. These names, Richard of Stowe and Hugh Herland and Henry Yeverley and perhaps a dozen others, that the patient work of architectural historians has recovered from the archives, are the exceptions that prove the rule. For every building master we can name, there are 50 we cannot. For every career we can partially reconstruct, there are hundreds that are entirely opaque. The named ones give us a glimpse of what the unnamed ones were like. They show us the scale of career that was possible for a skilled building craftsman in the medieval period. They show us the range of commissions that a senior master might hold simultaneously. They show us the quality of work that was achievable by someone working at the highest level of the Gothic tradition. And they make the silence around them, the silence of all those others, a little more specific, a little more present. There was a man who designed the vault of the Exeter chapter house. He had a career something like Yeverley's or something like Richard of Stowe's. He worked on multiple sites. He trained apprentices. He died, and his apprentices trained theirs, and the chain went on. His name is gone. His vault is still standing. It is enough. It is not nothing, but it is not enough. Go to Exeter. Look up at the chapter house vault. Know that someone made every one of those decisions, and that we will never know his name, and that the decisions were right, and that the vault has been standing for 700 years. Stand in that fact. It is where the real history lives. Not in the books. In the stone. Always in the stone. Good night. A note on the sources. The people who built the cathedrals of Britain did not leave memoirs. What they left is more durable than memoirs. They left the buildings themselves, which encode in their proportions and their geometry and their structural logic the knowledge that produced them. They left the building accounts, fragmentary but real, that record the wages and the materials and the disputes and the accidents of the work. They left the mason's marks, scratched into stone in the dark corners, where only a careful eye and a good light will find them. They left the templates and the working drawings, a tiny handful of them, by accident rather than intention. They left the lodge regulations and the guild documents, a few of them, from the very end of the medieval period. They left the portrait carvings, a handful of faces that may or may not be the faces of the builders. They left the acoustic, the specific reverberation of the stone spaces they made, still sounding in every cathedral that stands. From these traces, architectural historians have been working for generations to recover something of what the builders knew and who they were. The work is patient and detailed and conducted, mostly in archives and in the field, rather than in the spotlight. It is real scholarship, careful and critical, and it has produced a picture that is much richer and much more specific than the blank anonymity that the popular imagination tends to assume when it thinks about medieval builders. That picture is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The gaps in the documentary record are too large, and too many of the documents that once existed have been destroyed for a full recovery to be possible. But what is recoverable is extraordinary. a tradition of geometric knowledge derived from the observation of nature and transmitted through apprenticeship and lodge custom that produced the most sophisticated stone structures ever built in Britain. A network of craft relationships that connected building sites across the whole of England and beyond, allowing design innovations to spread rapidly and specialist knowledge to be brought to bear wherever it was needed. A social world of workers whose lives, glimpsed in account rolls and masons' marks and the occasional portrait carving, were fully human, fully complex, fully worthy of the attention we give to the buildings they made. They built extraordinary things. They were ordinary people. That combination is the real miracle. Not the stone floating above you in the vault, not the light coming through the glass. The fact that ordinary people, working for wages, trained by masters who had been trained by masters who had been trained by masters, going back to an origin that nobody can quite identify, produced the buildings that still stand today in every cathedral city in Britain. Ordinary people, extraordinary buildings, sleep. The work that remained a cathedral is never finished. This is not a poetic observation. It is a practical one. A building the size and complexity of a Gothic cathedral, built of limestone that weathers, lead roofing that degrades, timber that dries and cracks, mortar that fails as the centuries remove moisture, glass that is subject to wind pressure and chemical deterioration, simply requires continuous maintenance to survive. Every major English cathedral has a permanent staff of conservators, stonemasons, glaziers, and building managers, whose job is to maintain the fabric against the slow processes of decay. The work they do is invisible to the visitor. It happens in the scaffolded bays that are usually blocked off from public access. It happens in the roof spaces that visitors never enter. It happens on the exterior, where the carved stone is slowly being replaced, piece by piece, with new work cut to match the original. The stonemasons who do this work are the direct successors of the medieval builders, not through any mystical continuity of lineage, but through the practical continuity of skill. They use the same tools, in their essentials, that the medieval masons used. They cut stone by hand, with hammer and chisel and bolster. They use templates to transfer profiles from original to replacement. They read the original stone to understand how it was cut and what the cutter intended. They are the last practitioners, and in doing their work, they learn things about the original builders that no document could tell them. They learn from the stone how it was cut. They learn from the texture of a medieval carved surface what tool produced it and at what angle. They learn from the way a profile runs around a corner how the medieval mason solved the geometric problem of making a three-dimensional moulding turn from one plane to another. They are archaeologists of the hand. Their knowledge is specific and practical, and in a small way, irreplaceable. If the conservation programs at English cathedrals were to stop tomorrow, the knowledge of how to maintain these buildings would begin to thin within a generation. The skills that allow a stonemason to look at a piece of decayed medieval carving and understand what it was and how to replace it are not written in any book. They are in the hands of the people who have spent years learning them from other people who spent years learning them. The chain of transmission is thin, but it is not broken. The stone is still being worked. The buildings are still being maintained. The tradition, however attenuated, continues. And while it continues, the connection between the medieval builders and the present is not entirely metaphorical. Someone today is cutting stone with a template, in a tradition that goes back, through a long and sometimes thin chain of transmission, to the medieval lodges where the tradition was formed. Someone today is learning what the medieval masons knew. Not all of it. Not the full system, with its geometric cosmology and its fraternal mysteries and its lodge ceremonies that we can only partially reconstruct. But enough. Enough to keep the building standing. That is the job. The job continues. Good night.